Hello, I'm Grace Oedel, and today I'm with Niaz Dorry, the Coordinating Director of the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance and the Director of the National Family Farm Coalition. She's been named a Hero of the Planet by Time magazine and was the keynote speaker at the 2020 NOFA-Vermont Winter Conference, where she explored the importance of interdependence, thinking about food systems, and introducing the audience to a tool that she's building collaboratively called the Declaration of InterDependence. Thanks so much for being here and talking with me.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
I am interested in exploring this idea that you shared with us this morning. There is a difference between people who fish and people who extract seafood. Could you talk about that a little bit?
When I first started working on fisheries issues, I knew nothing about fisheries issues. I had just switched campaigns when I was at Greenpeace, and I was even a vegetarian, so I didn't even know what most seafood tasted like. And I realized that I had a lot to learn. And so I spent that learning opportunity fishing a lot. For my first, 3 to 5 years, I would fish on any boat that would be willing to take me. I would literally walk the docks, and I don't mean this in the oldest profession way, but walk the docks and go up to a boat where there were people working and say, "I'm Niaz, I work with Greenpeace, will you take me out fishing?" And had a variety of responses in return. And but the upshot of it was a lot of people did take me out fishing, and I learned a lot in that process. And one of the biggest lessons I learned, and there were some boats that I went fishing on where clearly nothing was different just because I was there. And then there were boats that you could tell that people had changed their practices because they had a visitor. That made me realize that not every fishing operation is the same. That was sort of my first lesson. It's almost as if you go onto a hog farm and suddenly all the floors are clean and all the animals that you see are all happy, but then on a day-to-day basis they're living in filth and they're living in unhappy circumstances. So I noticed that was one of my first learning moments. And then I started to pay attention to the scales of operation. Some boats I was going on may have been a big boat, but it had such a small place where it could hold fish that its scale wasn't necessarily dictated by the size of the boat. It was dictated by the values of the skipper. And so every one of those times that I was on a boat, I was learning more and more about people who fish. And then I started to get exposed to the factory fishing operations, the boats that literally have factories in their bows, and they have people that are working around the clock and they're fishing for months at a time. The value there is how much can you catch at the lowest cost of operation? How much can you just put out? Output was much more important than input of values or where you're fishing and how you're interacting with that ecosystem. And so all of those, the cumulative effect of all of those lessons on all of those boats was they're fishermen and they're people who are told just to go out and take a lot of things out of the ocean and transform them into unidentified food objects. And so that's to me where the difference is between people who fish and people who extract seafood. It's not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's helpful. In your 2018 America the Bountiful tour, how did you see a similar pattern around farmers and ranchers, and how were those parallels found on that tour?
Well, yes, and I think it's important to note that one of the reasons the fisheries work was resonating with me is because I already knew that was something that existed on the farming side. I had already had exposure to family farmers versus industrial agriculture, and the difference between people who raise pigs and people who are just holding pigs in captivity. So I already knew that. And so as I started to work on fisheries issues, I was drawing those parallels for myself. And I think they were definitely reinforced during the America the Bountiful tour. I should also note that most of the people, actually, with a couple of exceptions, almost all the farms or boats or ranchers that we visited would be considered small or mid-scale. And actually, majority were probably mid-scale. Few were small-scale. And one may be considered large-scale. It was a dairy farm that had over 1,000 heads of cattle in it. Everybody else was in those two categories. We only drove by industrial scale, kind of that manufacturing level, production level, facilities, CAFOs. I remember our first one that we saw driving into Iowa, for instance. You could just seeing the building, you knew what you were looking at. And so it was definitely reinforced for me what I already knew. And then that's just on the animal husbandry side. And then you drive through swaths of the country and all you see is corn and soy, corn and soy. Or what we were joking about was corn and beans, corn and beans. And to me, the similarities between that and on the seafood side is shrimp and salmon, shrimp and salmon. You know, we have this two predominant species that are the number 1 and 2 top eaten seafood in the world, at least in North America. Both of those those shrimp and those salmon are raised in highly industrialized aquaculture systems. The shrimp that comes from Southeast Asia, I remember interviewing Vandana Shiva a few years ago for a story I wrote about it. And her quote was, "People who eat farm shrimp should know they're eating the blood of our people." That's the kind of impact that industrial shrimp aquaculture has on people who live in Southeast Asia, farmers, land farmers who are losing access to their land because their land is being taken away to be flooded with seawater to raise shrimp for what? For us to be able to get $10.99 all you can eat shrimp, that half of it gets thrown away. And so the shrimp and salmon and corn and soy became our joke, but not very funny joke, because that's what we were seeing. We drive through large, vast areas of America and see corn and beans, and then you go to the coastal sides and you're not seeing what those fishermen are catching in the marketplace. What do you see? Shrimp and salmon, you know. So those are the things that we saw that really reinforce what I already knew.
So bear with me, because I'm a fisher person newbie. I don't know much about aquaculture, and I think one of the points that you made this morning that I appreciated was that there has been sort of two conversations, or I've been involved in agriculture for a long time, but I haven't really considered what is my relationship to the sea. I have used sprays and fish emulsion, and so I'm, of course, in relationship. I eat seaweed, I use salt, all of these points you made, and yet I haven't developed my understanding of that whole section of the world. And so I have a question, which is really probably basic in your mind. In organic farming, and when we think about regenerative practices, we think about the soil a lot. You know, feed the soil, nourish the soil, that's from whence it all comes. What is the correlate in the sea? Like, how can we think about what does a fisher person who's stewarding the resource look like and do?
I think the corollary there is the marine environment. You know, the least amount of, I don't want to use the word foreign objects, because I think foreign is a word that we use almost in a bad way these days, but things that don't belong in the marine environment, whether that is runoff from industrial agriculture, whether that's persistent bioaccumulative toxins that are dumped in there through manufacturing processes, or in some cases logging practices that are leading to soil erosion that ends up affecting estuaries. So the least amount of those impacts that we can have as a society, the better off the soil of the marine ecosystem is, because then the ecosystem, the marine part, is healthier. As a fisherman, what they can do is really pay attention to their scale of operation. There has been some policies that's been put into place, much like with agriculture, that has forced fishermen to scale up. And in their world, what scaling up means is, if you're a lobsterman, for instance, and I'll actually expand on this example a little bit. When I first started working on fisheries issues, most of the lobstermen that I worked with were using a couple of hundred traps, maybe, to catch lobsters. Because of the influence of what is known as the offshore lobster fleet, or the large-scale lobster fleet, they pushed for what they call trap limits, except they put the number at 800. Most fishermen who were catching lobster didn't even get close to 500, much rather 800. But suddenly law said, we're going to cap it at 8. And all of you can scale up to 800 traps. So suddenly you have traps in the water that are marking turf and that are just there to exist, not so much to catch fish, because most of those boats, most of those fishermen don't even have the capacity to tend to 800 traps. And so as fishermen, to be able to organize to resist that kind of a strategy and not take that suggestion that success is once again being defined as how big you get, how many traps you have, and how much fish you catch, but as how much within your own means can you live, how well can you do to get the most value out of what you really want to do, which is fish with 200 traps. And so as fishermen, that is one of the best things that they can do, is to really pay attention to their scales of operation and not to try to compete with the industrial fishing sector, but to compete with themselves and their abilities. And then there is the marketplace and what we as eaters of seafood are willing to accept. And so some of those lead the fishing industry to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. For example, in New England, we can catch over 60 different types of fish. As eaters, we eat maybe 10. What does it happen to the rest of it? They're being caught, they're being killed most of the time, yet the fisherman thinks that we're not going to value anything other than those top 10 species, so they get thrown overboard, dead. And so how do we change our eating habits to allow fishermen to be better cultivators of the ocean, if you will, by bringing in whatever happens to be caught in their gear? Because it's not magic. If fishing gear suddenly doesn't happen to only bring to shore cod and haddock. There's an ecosystem out there. The cod and haddock live in an ecosystem, and so what they swim with is going to end up in that fishing net. And as eaters of seafood, as a society, we need to honor that in order for the fishermen to be able to live in harmony. They want to live in harmony. Fish has seasons, much like strawberries do. And most fishermen are forced to build bigger boats so they can go to where the fish are versus wait for the fish to come to you, which is where the seasonality comes in. You want to stay away from them when they're spawning. So what would you do then? At one point, you would just sit home and you wouldn't be able to go and catch X species because it's spawning time. Now, with the expansion of the capacity to build bigger and bigger boats, you go wherever the fish are instead of waiting for the fish to be available to you. So those are some of the things we can do, but it requires the commitment to that, cultivating the soil element from both the eater side and the fisherman side, much like with agriculture. Farmers are feeding the soil because as eaters, we're saying we want you to do that. We're willing to eat something else so that what you're growing or not growing right now can benefit the soil. We need to bring similar mentality to our seafood system.
Thank you. I'm particularly interested about this idea of scale because it so deeply impacts our farmers. And one of the things we struggle with here in Vermont is that we'll never compete at scale. We don't want to compete at scale, but we never will. And what we're seeing with this giant succession in dairy farms is the capitalist force of get big or you are no longer viable. And so what we need to scale up in is developing organizing power, speaking the ethic of small and mid-sized farms, and with ethical practices, as you've said, organic practices that center people and land. And I'm wondering, how have you seen communities be successful? What strategies do you employ for pushing back on the capitalist telos? The end game of capitalism is get as big as possible. So in order to value anything else can feel extremely daunting. And do you have sort of insight in how to be effective doing that work? What does it require? How do we benchmark our way there?
We hear a lot about narrative change these days in our various work, and that is what is needed. We need to change the story, and we need to change some of the definitions. Maybe not even change, but take back some of the definitions that have been co-opted. So, for example, success. I talk about this all the time. The definition of success has been completely turned on its head. Has become, so how is success defined in the capitalist sort of society is numbers. The higher the number, the bigger your boat, the bigger acreage you have, the most pigs you kill, the most soy you grow. It is always about volume, not about value. And so we have been really focusing on shifting the narrative away from success being defined as high volume, low value operations to being defined as low volume, high value operations. And that means, as a society, we acknowledge the worth of the work that farmers, fishermen, and ranchers put in there, which means we're willing to give them the prices that they deserve for their catch or their animals or what they're growing. And that we recognize that that is not only the price of that piece of food that we're buying, but it's the price of creating that piece of food in ways that matches our values as a society and as eaters. And so shifting all of that takes a lot of work. And it can be daunting to change narrative on such a fundamental level when the other part of the capitalist narrative is you're then going to take food out of all the poor people. If you are talking about success being defined by value, that means you're no longer going to have $1 hamburger at McDonald's, and that's where the poor people eat. Well, let's look at that and see, when did McDonald's become the predominant food source in some communities where wealth is an issue or resources is an issue? We took away their supermarkets. We took away their access to land so they can grow their own food. And now we're telling them the only kind of food you can eat is $1 hamburger or $1 fillet of fish that comes with all these external costs, not to mention the externalities that refer to our health and well-being as a society. And so I feel like we need to take back. That is our number one task, is to take back. The other is the concept of scale. I feel like we are adopting the language of the broken system when we talk about scaling up versus scaling out. We need to become better at reaching more communities and taking our food to more places. We don't need to produce more. We need to increase access to what is already there. That to me is a web creation, not a scaling up creation. And so it requires us to even recognize that we are buying into some of even our funders say, well, how are you going to scale that up? Well, we're not interested in scaling it up. We're interested in scaling it out. And we have to explain what we mean by that. And organizing, to me, is sort of the essence of organizing is scaling out and not scaling up. So we've been working with a lot of folks on the seafood side, on the NAMA side, a lot of other organizations and movements that believe this narrative, that have already agreed that scaling out and community building and movement building is important. So we are a part of the New Economy Coalition, for example, that's really focused on creating a new economic structure and not just taking what the existing structure says should be our how we value things. And so we get the NAC members to start paying attention to the work that we do. We've also been doing a lot of really what I think is inspiring work with healthcare institutions through Healthcare Without Harm, which even though they have a long way to go, but their National Healthy Food and Healthcare Program has been really a great ally of ours on the seafood side. In fact, our early adopter for relocalizing our seafood system and scaling out instead of scaling up, if you will, was University of Vermont Medical Center. Diane Emery and her team came on on a tour, on a field trip that Healthcare Without Harm and Diane organized to Gloucester, and they left that field trip with taking a bunch of seafood from New England and start to practice how to use regional seafood in their hospital instead of what is considered sustainable because it has the Marine Stewardship Council label on it, which they then came to find out that its carbon footprint was something like 15,000 miles, and it's being caught by factory fishing operations. But because it met this overfishing definition that's very narrowly defined by federal legislation, it was branded this Marine Stewardship Council name. And Diane's quote is probably the best one. She said, we were following these third-party certifications, and we thought we were doing the right thing, but then we laid out our organizational values and realized that we needed to go deeper. So they shifted their purchasing policies and allowed some of the fishing communities that we've been working with to scale out by getting some of their catch into universities and hospitals and places within the region that were willing to take diversity of species that they were catching. They were willing to pay them closer to their cost of production, and they were willing to take the risk and offer these often unknown seafood items to their patients and to their students. And so some of those efforts have really been helpful in both changing the narrative, creating new markets, and scaling out opportunities.
Thank you. That's awesome. How would you speak to a consumer or a person who's not involved with food providing for their community who on a day-to-day basis to think about these more nuanced conversations? One, as you say, a third-party certification. This is one of the things we struggle with organic. It means something, but does the person buying the food really have an understanding of what's the difference between a Driscoll's organic berry that's grown in a factory in California and a berry grown at Riverberry Farm here in Vermont that's grown in the soil and is really healing the land? How do you go about building that cultural awareness and deep understanding when we're so far away from that right now?
Yeah, it takes time, and I recognize that impatience is one of our biggest problems. and I think it's really important.
Colin, that is calling me out for sure. Yes.
Oh, am I?
Well,
I
I think there is definitely a need to think longer term. And that's one of the things that Lisa Fernandez, who will be with us tomorrow, speaks to a lot that I try to hold in mind. Short-term solutions are not the way forward.
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of the problems that we're trying to undo were sold to us as short-term solutions to something that was artificially created in some cases. But agribusiness was sold to us as, well, this is what we need to do to feed people now. Well, okay, if we'd stopped at that moment and thought about what do we need to do to feed people over a long period of time, is to make sure they have access to land, and they have access to seed, and they have access to fishing rights, and that treaties are honored. That's how people get fed over a long period of time. Consolidating land and farms and production to pump out high volumes of so-called food that's void of nutritional values and values in general was a very short-term solution. And the Green Revolution hasn't solved the problem of feeding the world. It has created even more hungry people, but it has solved the problem of those who want predictable, squares of whatever to be able to get that consistently. But that wasn't a problem we had before. And so these short-term solutions have created tomorrow's problems in many ways. And I want us to think about how do we prevent tomorrow's problems instead of creating them. And that takes some patience. That takes some pausing. And we're experiencing that right now with kelp. And there is this push to grow more kelp in the ocean. In fact, the Department of Energy has some proposal, and I'm probably not right on the exact numbers, but something like 18,000 some odd acres of the ocean to grow kelp for energy. and you're seeing ads by Exxon on television talking about kelp, the future of energy. What does privatizing 18,000 acres of the ocean and potentially affecting any other animals that interact in that ecosystem, because we don't want to address our energy dependency, we just want to find another way to feed it. That to me is creating tomorrow's problems. So we really need to pause. We need to not get so enamored with these shiny objects that keep being put in front of us, and really think about the long-term solutions that we have to create if we really want people to live in harmony with each other. Forget the planet, let's just say with each other, and then the planet. But it just it takes patience. And with third-party certifications, I feel like people need to unlearn before they can learn something new. It's like, your file cabinets are full and you have enough to deal with before you can file another piece of paper. You need to purge some stuff. How do you and take that analogy a little bit further. How often have I punted going through my file cabinets because I can't even fathom the process that it takes to look through what I'm going to get rid of and what I value. Imagine that being a person's mind, and all the lessons that we've been taught over our life and all the struggles we're having on a daily basis. And then everybody's coming at you saying, you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong, you got to get rid of this thing, you got to start eating this. I'll go in the fetal position in no time, So just allowing people to even do one thing differently, one thing at a time, to not find that purging as a chore, but as a liberation. To give that space to people. We need to be patient with those who are struggling with the fact that if we tell them these third-party certifications are flawed, suddenly they're saying, so you're saying I've believed in something that was a lie? That whole process, mentally, spiritually, for some folks is hard. And so how do we build patience into our work as organizers, to give people the space they need to adjust, and give them one thing to do differently, and not lose our cool when they are not where we need to be. There's a really interesting philosophy that was laid out by this guy his name was William Bridges. And he talks about the transitions process and how change and transition are two different things. And as organizers and social justice advocates in particular, if we don't pay attention to the changes people are experiencing and we're putting them through, and the transitions that they're also experiencing at the same time, they're going to come back and bite us in the butt. They're just going to revolt instead of listen to us. And that's really true when it comes to our food, especially when we want people to experience those changes. We want people to know that eating strawberries only during the season is actually better for you. It tastes better. It looks better. It's better for the planet. But the transitional time that it takes to absorb that, and the change that they may be going through when it comes to their pocketbook and how much money they have, if we don't pay attention to those things, they're just going to not do it and end up rebelling even further. So patience, pay attention to where the society is, where people are experiencing, what people are experiencing at the moment is key. But I also recognize that we're dealing with accelerated levels of damage. And so I understand our impatience. But none of this happened overnight. We were feeding ourselves well in harmony with the planet for hundreds and thousands of years, and we're experiencing the effects of the last 40, 50 years. And so this has been a short blip on the radar. And if we have patience, I believe we can do it in a way that it's not just a blip on the radar, but more of a long-term, steady line.
So in spirit of moving towards those solutions that will actually have long-term lasting potential, I see your work celebrating interdependence as a piece of that work. And could you speak to your project, the Declaration of InterDependence, and also share about what that process is looking like right now and where it's leading?
Well, the Declaration of Interdependence started as a way to neutralize the forces that were blaming farmers, especially farmers and rural communities, for our current state of the current state in our society, the hatred, the vitriolic language that we were hearing during the leading up to and since the 2016 election, even just in the last couple of days, seeing on Twitter feeds, farmers did this to themselves, or farmers are going to vote this way again. And we felt really strongly that we needed to find a way to show the rest of our society, particularly those living in urban areas, that the image that's been drawn about rural America and rural communities and farming communities in particular is inaccurate. And that it is true that there are folks in rural country, much like in urban communities, that are racist, sexist, xenophobic, and hateful people. But just like urban communities are not a monolith, neither are rural communities. So it began as that. It began as a way for us to really show those people who we work with as who they are, not as who they're painted to be. And then we also felt that one of the ways to do that in a really strong way is to bring the fishing and farming communities together and show not only their interdependence between each other, but also the interdependence between these rural communities and the urban communities, or those who have felt that they needed to resist them versus working with them to be part of the resistance, And so that's how it began. And I think it got strengthened during the America the Bountiful tour, because I got to meet more of those folks who don't fit the definition that I was hearing about in popular media or through pundits or whomever else about who rural America is really comprised of. Where it stands today is we continue, it's one of those situations where I feel like we got caught in a little bit of analysis paralysis. Do we have the right declaration? Do we have the right language? And we want to finalize it. We have this vision of getting input from diversity of folks in order to finalize, or at least have as much of a final document of a declaration that lists our grievances and also lays out what our vision is for a food bill of rights. But unlike the Declaration of Independence, we want the first signatories to be the first people on this land. And so that will take some time in order to not only get the input and not the input, but their participation. And we've had some conversations with some of the indigenous communities around the Declaration of Interdependence. And so we wanted to have meaning, and that and so we have this vision of a signing ceremony that's actually led by the indigenous communities, and others are there, but they are not the force to sign it. So when that'll happen, I'm not sure. I was really grateful for the input that people brought into the drafting process today. And we got another set of input a couple of years ago from folks who attended Farm Aid. And that's actually the current version, came out of the input we got at Farm Aid 2 years ago. And so we'll take what we've learned here today and take a look at the draft and have create the next version, and then give ourselves a date where we want to have that ceremony that we envision, and then use it as an organizing tool.
I love that. Thank you. You seem to really embody interdependence, bringing other people along with you, working in partnerships, bringing organizations together, other people when we asked you for your bio picture, you said that you were not crazy about sending your own picture alone because you were doing all of this work in coalition. And I'm wondering if you'd like to share any of the people you're organizing with, projects or names, and or any ancestors on whose shoulders you feel like you're standing to bring into the conversation and just think about your lineage right now.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think for me, the power of going beyond singular organizations really came to me a couple of years after I had transitioned from working on toxics issues to working on fisheries issues. And I remember the moment when I was sitting in the basement. We had a coalition fighting against factory fishing boats. And one of the lessons that we had learned fighting the incinerator, and I might digress in a minute, but I'm getting somewhere, was we had the various permits that the city or the company had given us for this company called Waste Technologies Incorporated. And on one permit, it said WTI, Inc. On another permit, it said W.T.I, Inc. And we just chalked it all up to punctuation errors and whoever made an error. Well, thanks to T.C. Brown, who was an investigative reporter for the Cleveland Plain Dealer at the time, we found out these were 44 different corporations with 44 different articles of incorporation. Most of them were incorporated in Delaware, somewhere elsewhere. And so fast forward to when I was fighting this factory fishing operation and being in this basement of this church where our coalition met. And the city had given me a piece of paper about the company, and one of the shareholders had leaked us a piece of paper, same piece of paper. And I'm looking at it, and there's a difference in the punctuation of the names of the company from one paper to the other. And I had this moment of, can I say that?
Sure.
Holy shit. and I remember looking up and saying, you guys, I think we're talking about two different companies. And everybody in the room did the same thing we did back in East Liverpool. Said, oh, that's just a punctuation error. I said, you know what? I don't think so. I think we're dealing with two different companies. Trust me on this one. So we went ahead and we dug deeper, and we found out this company that was selling itself as a local organization, and we're going to hire local fishermen. We're going to do this locally, was actually 95% Dutch owned by this company called Parlefleet and Vanderplas, who has made it its work to prospect where there were high volumes of certain fish that their factory boats could fish it for, and essentially force their way into those communities. Exact same strategy hazardous waste toxic incinerators were using. And so I thought, oh my goodness, this is exactly why we need to work across movements, because had I not had that experience, I would not have noticed that period or comma or whatever it was that caught my eye, and we could not have then blown the cover for this so-called local company who was going to take over the working waterfronts and affect the health of a very key species in the fishing industry. From there on, even though my instincts had always told me we needed to work across movements, it really became an important part of how I felt we needed to work, because none of us have the universe in our heads. You know, different experiences exist in different coalitions and different movements, and there's inspiration there to be had. There is lessons to be learned, and I think the more we do cross-pollinate, the better we are as a movement. We can come to each other's rescue. We can come to each other's support, whether it's because you're in crisis or because you need an extra hand or because you're celebrating, whatever it happens to be. And so that's really become, that moment really led me to try to embody that as much as I could in the work that we do. When we did NAMA's strategic plan, coming up on 5 years now, as we were laying out our work and the role we played as staff of an organization, we saw ourselves in 3 categories. We called it the birds, the bees, and the worms. So as the birds, we're always in that high level, 30,000 foot altitude to see what networks should we be talking to? Who is saying all the right things, but they're not including seafood in their thinking? And just sweep down and talk with them, and if need be, force our way into their network, which we do often. And but then do it gently and politely, but then really get them to understand why they should be talking about this. And then the bees, once we do identify those, how do we pollinate those other networks with our values and with our strategies? And it's a reciprocating process. We're not always just the takers. We're also stepping up when we need to act in solidarity and as allies or as accomplices, whatever we need to be. And then the worms, we've came up with a set of values that we feel are really important. So those values are fortifying the various networks that we work with. And so this 30,000 foot level is where I feel, as one staff person in this organization, that I feel is where I have arrived at, where I was the worm for a long time. As an organizer, I was probably the pollinator, the bees, for a long time. But I feel much more comfortable being at this 30,000 foot altitude, playing the bird role for now, because I feel those experiences have taught me to be on the lookout for who do we need to have in our fold and vice versa, and really working on enriching those relationships and strengthening those relationships. So that's probably that. I hope that that's what's coming across in a statement from you, that you feel like I'm embodying that kind of a work, is because it's taken, I'm 56 now, so it's taken whatever number of years that it's taken for me to graduate to that 30,000 foot altitude, where looking for opportunities to really build cross-sector collaborations I feel like that's my calling, that's my purpose in this work at this moment. So that's the long-winded answer to that question. In terms of whose shoulder, my heritage is Iranian. And so my father was a social activist, and I feel like, and he was a journalist. And so I feel like I like to think I'm a good storyteller because of the genetic element that has come. And I'd like to think that I am a good social justice advocate, again, because of my heritage and what my family has experienced. So I bring those with me, and it's a heritage that I resisted for a long time, much like many young people do, rebel and not want to be associated with who you really are. And it was actually through the food that I got reconnected to my heritage. One of the only things I used to do once a year was to celebrate our New Year, which is on the first day of spring. And when I began to do it much more thoughtfully, as opposed to just as it's a new year, I began to pay attention to the food, the ingredients, the ceremony behind it. And then I started to wonder about some of my other habits that didn't seem to come from this society. And I couldn't figure out exactly where they were coming from. And I began to connect it to my heritage and my culture. And then I started to appreciate it. And so after years of resistance to where you come from, you get to the point where you're thinking, all right, that's my foundation, and I need to honor that. I can be myself and be who I am, but some of the ways that I live are rooted in those foundational elements.
That is good to hear. Thank you. I do feel like you are occupying this bird role, or matriarch, leader, person who has achieved some bigger vision than the rest of us might have doing our work in the day-to-day. So I thank you for that.
Oh, I'm not sure I would say I achieved. I think that's aspirational. It will continue to be aspirational. It's where I want to be. And I think every once in a while I see the fruits of that aspiration. It's what we strive towards that matters, I guess.
Well, we're really glad to have your voice here.
Thank you.
And appreciate the framing of our whole time together. So thank you.
Thank you.